When Nora Whitaker pulled the dusty tarp in her grandfather's abandoned woodshop, a sharp click echoed, like a metal valve releasing after decades of silence. Beneath the heavy cloth was a copper moonshine shining strangely bright, as if someone had secretly polished it the night before. She nearly stumbled backwards when her fingers brushed it. The metal was warm, faintly vibrating, as if it were waiting for her. The whole town had called it a relic from the bootlegging days. But this thing had never died. If you believe some legacies are waiting to wake up, subscribe and keep walking with us. Nora Whitaker had never planned to return to Shady Glen. She'd sworn she never would. Not after that last argument with her grandfather, in the kitchen that always smelled of burnt wood and plum liquor. "I don't need that old workshop," she had said coldly. "I've got work in San Jose. I can 3D print parts, code AIs. I don't need steam." He didn't argue, just nodded once and poured more plum liquor into a cracked porcelain cup. That was the last time they looked each other in the eye. 10 years passed. 1 engineering degree, 2 failed startups, 3 student loans she couldn't pay off. Nora sat in her Tacoma apartment, surrounded by unopened bills, staring at an email titled, "Notice of Inheritance, Harold Whitaker." She laughed. Not the kind that carried joy, just the sound that comes out when everything else has already collapsed. She drove a rented pickup down the winding maple syrup highway 3 days later. The local radio droned. "Rural Vermont is seeing its most significant real estate investment wave in decades. Small towns are being bought and revitalized by out-of-state corporations." Nora shut it off. Her eyes stayed on the red maples along the shoulder, like old flames burning their last season. Her grandfather's cabin leaned tiredly on the hillside. The tin roof rusted through. The shutters hung loose. Weeds covered the porch steps. Beside it stood the woodshop, once his pride, now just a hollow shell of sawdust and silence. A woman waited on the porch. Aunt Irene, the neighbor who'd known Harold her whole life. She didn't smile, didn't hug, just handed Nora a folded envelope. "He told me to give you this, if you ever came back. Folks said you never would. I wasn't so sure." Inside, there was no letter, just a row of dots and dashes scrawled in faded blue ink, Morse code. Nora whispered the translation under her breath, her voice trembling. "Under the floor. Left corner. Key. If you're still patient enough to understand." She gripped the paper tightly, something flickering deep in her chest. Not quite emotion, not yet belief, but the sting of a challenge. A sound broke the silence behind her. Rubber on grass. She turned. A scruffy-haired boy stood by the gate holding a bike. "Hey, are you Mr. Harold's granddaughter?" "Yeah. He talked about you a lot. Said you could read those dot and dash codes." Before she could answer, the boy pedaled away, the wheels crunching through the weeds. Nora watched him go, her pulse slowing, steady, uncertain. Not because of what he'd said, but because she suddenly realized the truth. The legacy wasn't just alive. The basement sat behind a recessed wooden door, hidden by an empty bookshelf. Nora turned the key exactly as the Morse map had shown. The lock creaked and snapped open, like it had just exhaled after years of silence. She turned on her flashlight. A narrow wooden staircase led downward. Cold air rose to meet her, laced with damp wood, aged metal, and something hauntingly familiar. Sweet, slightly tart, like the warm apple liquor that drifted through her grandfather's kitchen on the coldest winter nights. The basement wasn't large, but it was obsessively organized. In the center stood a handcrafted copper still, round-bodied, with coiled pipes and a cooling system built for water convection. Beside it sat wooden barrels, a press, a condenser tank, and hand-welded steam valves. Every bolt looked hand-etched. Nora stepped closer. A burlap cloth covered the control panel. She pulled it down carefully. Beneath the dust, engraved into the metal, Hollow Star MiG-3, Final Build, HW 1985. She drew a deep breath. In the far corner, a small wooden shelf held glass bottles in the color amber. Each bore a rice paper label, hand-drawn with a 5-pointed hollow star. The name, The Hollow Star, Not for Sale. Secondary label, Winter Lot, Maple Sap Edition. One bottle had cracked. When she picked it up, the neck gave way, and a ribbon of thick liquid slid out. The scent hit instantly, sharp, pungent, overwhelming. She staggered back, coughing. That smell, familiar, too strong for now. A memory crashed through. As a child, she'd thought her grandfather drank too much. But looking now at the components and the notes, it was clear he hadn't been drinking. He'd been experimenting. On the workbench lay a canvas-bound engineering notebook, filled margin to margin in his hand. Schematics, heat-to-pressure ratios, scribbled notes like zero-waste distillation using local maple sap, max flavor retention without artificial filtering, hand-sealed, never bottled for sale. This wasn't the work of a backyard hobbyist. It was the blueprint of a true inventor. Nora frowned and flipped the main switch. A few seconds later, a low hum rose, steady and soft, like a heartbeat. She placed her palm on the copper shell. The metal was cool with time, but that hum, that feeling, made it seem as if something inside was still alive. She whispered, mostly to herself, "Grandpa, I've never seen anything like this." And at that moment, she wasn't someone searching for what had been left behind. She was someone who had just found what no one else had managed to keep. A black SUV pulled to the gate 3 days after Nora restarted the system. It was clean enough to reflect the maple trees, swaying over the dirt road. She was oiling one of the steam valves when the car door slammed shut. "Ms. Whitaker?" The man approaching wore a white button-down gray tie and a smile as thin as a blade. "I'm Calvin Denton. I represent Riverside Holdings. We've been following the status of the estate." Nora straightened, wiping her hands on a rag. "I'm not selling. Most people wait until they hear the offer." He handed her a sealed envelope. 7 figures, no escrow, no contingencies. We can sign by the end of the week. "No. Do you realize this land sits atop one of the rarest aquifers in the region?" Denton continued, unfazed. "The state's development board has marked this area as high potential. If you refuse, let's just say, things could get complicated with your zoning file." Nora's fingers tightened around the rag. "My grandfather left a fully legal will." "True, but he also emailed us in 2004. Denton pulled out a USB stick. "Inside is documentation that he once considered selling. You might want to review it carefully. My grandfather would never sell his legacy." "You sure about that?" Denton tilted his head. "He once submitted a design draft to the Vermont Engineers Guild. Looks suspiciously similar to the device in your basement." Nora flinched. "We don't need it all. We could preserve a piece as a museum, great for PR." "And bulldoze the rest to build a spa?" Nora shot back, dry. "Eco-resort," Denton corrected, adjusting his cuff. "And if you still say no, we have other avenues." Nora snatched the USB, then tossed his business card to the gravel. "Get off this land." Denton didn't argue. He bent down, picked up the card, and brushed it clean. "We'll be in touch when you've had time to reconsider." The SUV turned and rolled off slowly, tires grinding on crushed stone. Nora stood still, her heart pounding. Then she plugged the USB into her laptop. A folder blinked open. Star, Hollow, Surveys, Internal Models. Inside, not just satellite images, but full 3D renderings of a planned teardown and rebuild of the site. In the bottom corner of the blueprint, demolition phase 1, remove legacy equipment, salvage copper. The next morning, as Nora was flipping through the engineering notebook to find the section on condenser maintenance, a knock echoed at the door. Aunt Irene stood on the porch, arms wrapped around an old tin box secured with a copper wire. "This, your grandfather left with me," she said, setting it gently on the table. "He told me to give it to you only if you came back, and if you hadn't left again after 3 days. Nora hesitated, then unlocked it. Inside lay a stack of handwritten liquor labels, pressed between sheets of old rice paper. Each one bore a batch name, a date, and a small personal note. Winter 1982 for May. Spring batch. Testing new formula, don't tell Nora. Final bottle. Keep sealed unless truly necessary. At the bottom of the box, folded small, was a handwritten letter in blue ink. The handwriting trembled, as if trying to stay steady. "Nora, if you're reading this, it means you've come back. Maybe because you're lost. Maybe because you've run out of options. Or maybe because you haven't forgotten. After your grandmother passed, I didn't know what to do with the winter nights. The house was empty, the air too cold, my hands too still. So I started again, with copper, with steam, with memory. That machine wasn't built to produce, it was built to remember. I remember her voice, warmth, and the sound of days that no longer exist. And if you understand that, then you don't need any more instructions." Nora sat still for a long time, not reading again. Her hand brushed over the words, "to remember." And suddenly, a memory of her mother returned. A car door slamming shut in the dark. Her grandfather clutching the 6-year-old girl, as if afraid the wind would take them both away. She understood now. He had been left behind, just like her. Nora poured a drop of liquor from the last unbroken bottle. The liquid shimmered like honey, glowing amber under the dim light. When it touched her lips, the first taste was sharp, then soft and faintly salty, like melting snow. It felt like she was drinking an entire forgotten winter. She folded the letter, picked up a pencil, and opened a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "Day 5 checked condenser. The machine still breathes. Maybe that's enough to begin again." She no longer needed permission. No map, no proof. Only the will to hold on to what no one else had managed to keep. Nora was gone from the workshop for less than 2 hours. She'd gone to the town library to submit her heritage application. Copies of the engineering notes, her grandfather's letter, photographs of the labels, and the statement she'd stayed up all night to write. She stopped at the old bakery near the square on the way back. She let herself think for the first time in years. Maybe things were finally turning around. When she got home, the workshop door was wide open. The padlock had been cut. Paint scraped off the frame. Tracks in the dust where someone had moved quickly. Inside, the still was intact. But everything that mattered was gone. The original notebook, her grandfather's letter, the tin box of labels, and the last bottle marked, "Don't open unless truly necessary." Nora froze. She stepped inside carefully, as if any movement might worsen the loss. Nothing was broken, nothing vandalized, just gone. Then she smelled it. Gasoline. Not much, but enough to make her pulse quicken. On the work table lay a folded piece of paper, typed, unsigned. You don't know who you're dealing with. Sell before it's too late. Her hands shook. She called the police. A young officer arrived nearly an hour later, his tone indifferent. You sure you didn't just misplace them? I don't usually cut my own locks, Nora replied dryly. He scribbled a few notes, offered no promises, and left. That evening, Nora received an email from the county zoning office. We've received your documentation. However, as the property falls under a designated development zone, the county board may exercise its right of eminent domain if proof of ownership and heritage value cannot be verified. The words eminent domain cut through her like ice. If they took the land, the machine would be dismantled. The workshop is leveled. There'd be nothing left to fight for. Nora sank to the cold floor, staring at the room around her. Copper, pipes, the still, all still standing, yet the soul of it had been taken. As night fell, Aunt Irene called. Nora didn't answer. She didn't sleep, didn't cry. She just sat in the thick, heavy air that smelled of old steam and unfinished liquor. I came back too late, Grandpa, she whispered, her voice breaking. Nora sat motionless beside the window when she heard a car pull into the yard. She didn't want to see anyone, not the police, a neighbor, or a voice trying to offer comfort, but the person who stepped in was Will. The scruffy-haired boy, arms wrapped around a large cardboard box, was breathing hard from the weight. You forgot this at the library, Will said. I brought it back. Nora stood slowly, confused. What? Will set the box on the table. Inside were all the original documents, the handwritten letter, the bottle labels, a stamped copy of the engineering notebook, all bearing certification from the Vermont Historical Library. Nora backed up, stunned. How did you? Will scratched his head. You left them outside the shop Tuesday afternoon. I saw the top page blow off in the wind. I was afraid it'd get wet, so I brought it to the library myself. Nora still couldn't believe it. How'd you know where to bring it? Will gave a slight grin. Mr. Harold used to say, a real engineer never files anything in the wrong place. She laughed, choked. Will went on, he also taught me to back up everything. Said, you can lose your gear, your notebook, even your people, but if you've got a copy, no one can erase you completely. Nora hugged him. For the first time since coming back to town, not out of gratitude, but because someone had believed in her, long before she had dared to believe in herself. After Will left, Nora returned quietly to the workshop. She wiped down every part of the still, her hands lingering over the lower panel, the spot her grandfather used to knock to check pressure. Something shifted inside. She grabbed her tools and removed the maintenance panel. Inside, wrapped in moisture-resistant plastic, was a second letter. The paper had yellowed, the handwriting once again in trembling blue ink. If you're reading this, it probably means everything you had was taken. But that's okay. The most valuable things can't be stolen. I hid this letter here because if anyone else found it, they wouldn't understand. But if it's you, I know you stayed. The Hollow Star isn't just a machine. It's how I loved, how I forgave, how I remembered, without having to say it. If you ever see Will again, tell him this. A pressure system always needs a safety valve. And you, Nora, you're the safety valve for this legacy. She didn't hold back her tears. For the first time, she didn't feel left behind. She felt entrusted. Less than a week later, the Vermont State Heritage Council issued an official statement. Star Hollow Distillery is recognized as a rare example of artisanal engineering. All development projects on the property are hereby suspended for investigation and cultural asset protection. Nora printed the notice and taped it to the workshop door. That afternoon, her phone rang. The caller ID, Calvin Denton. She picked up, not waiting for him to speak. "You should pull your people out. The Heritage Office is involved now." Denton sighed. "You know, Nora, this really didn't have to be so hard." "No, it didn't," she replied, calm. "But if you thought I was standing alone, you were wrong." And she hung up. For the first time, the workshop gate stood open for the townspeople on Saturday morning. There was no ribbon to cut, no celebration. Just a wooden sign on the porch. Workshop open for those who still believe in hands, steam, and memory. Aunt Irene brought an old pressure gauge from 1940. It had belonged to her husband. Mr. Rudy, the carpenter, arrived with a hammer whose handle was engraved with his grandfather's name. A young girl brought a school notebook from her electronics class. Will helped pump water into the system. Nora lit the flame. Steam began to curl through the copper pipes, and a soft hiss filled the air, like the sound of someone waking after a long, long sleep. The first batch was small, but enough to give everyone a taste, poured into small glass cups, passed from hand to hand like a ritual. No one said much. They didn't have to. An older man whispered, "Tastes like Vermont, the way it used to be." A woman began to cry. "Smells like the apple brandy my dad made, back when I was in 4th grade." Nora didn't speak. She stood at the back, not like a founder, but like someone who had fulfilled what was passed down. At the end of the gathering, she used the remaining drops from the winter lot, 1985 bottle, to seal the first bottle of the new era. She hand-labeled it, "The Hollow Star, Reclaimed 2023. Then, I placed it on a small wooden shelf, not for display, but as a reminder. Not everything old needs to be thrown away. Some things are kept, because they still have something left to say. Autumn arrived quickly. Maple leaves fell like slow-burning fire along the edges of the workshop's rusted tin roof. Nora sat on the porch, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, bare feet resting on rough wooden planks. The wind carried the scent of apple liquor and damp wood. The smell you only get in places that haven't been sealed shut. Places still warmed by human presence. She opened the mailbox and found a handwritten envelope with no return address. Inside was a simple note. "I'm a senior mechanical engineering student in Montana. I happened to see a photo of your workshop on a forum. Thank you for reminding me why I chose this path. I've started rebuilding my grandfather's still. Not to sell, just to understand him." Nora finished reading and folded the letter slowly. She sat in silence for a long time. Then a smile crept onto her face. Not bright, not loud, but warm, like the first sip of plum wine in a new season. That afternoon, Will rode up on his bike again, stopping just outside the gate. "You remember your promise?" he called out. Nora raised an eyebrow. "You promised to teach me how to make the liquor," Will said, already pulling his backpack open, revealing a notebook, heat-resistant gloves, and a pair of old safety goggles. "I'm ready," she laughed, nodded. "Then we start by checking the pressure." Nora opened a new notebook inside the workshop, gray cover, the first page still blank. But instead of writing to herself, she wrote for whoever came next. If you found this notebook, it means this place is still breathing. And if you're feeling unsure, overwhelmed, or wondering whether you're holding on to the right thing, just stay one more day. Some things don't need scaling up, don't need modernizing. Some things need a pair of hands, patience, and someone willing to believe in the old ways. She closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf beside her grandfather's wooden mallet, wrapping it in coarse cloth. The evening light filtered through a dusty window, casting a golden line across the copper still. A valve hissed softly, like someone exhaling relief after a long winter. Nora stood there, not as someone who had once walked away, but as someone who had learned how to stay and carry forward. If stories like this remind you that some things are worth keeping alive, hit subscribe. Because legacies like these don't need to be loud. They just need to be passed on.